Hello and welcome to Digital Photo Mentor. I'm Darlene, and this is my weekly live stream for photo editing tips. This week, we're going to be focusing on Lightroom and editing using Lightroom Classic. If you're new here, welcome. I will be editing subscriber submitted images, and this one that you see over here is how you can participate as well. There's a form for you to fill in if you'd like to submit one or two of your images to watch me demonstrate how I approach editing that particular image. So not only will I be talking about how to use Lightroom specifically to edit the images that I've chosen to show today, but I'll also be talking a little bit about, why I'm doing what I'm doing, what the ultimate goal is with that particular image, and some tips along the way in terms of possible photography ideas as well, or photography tips. So anything that comes up. Let me just see. I just inhaled my own saliva. You know what that happens. Let me jump over to Lightroom and I'll pop into the chat. I'll be right back. All right, I got to figure out how to get out of this mode now. No, still in full mode here. I can't figure out how to get out of full view now. I went full view on my Lightroom and now I can't get the panels back. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Okay, well, we're gonna go like this, I guess. All right, comments. Let's see who is in the house today. We've got Raymond, California. Welcome. Mark is in Houston. Merle, Windy, Michigan. Linton from down under in Australia. Have your coffee. I'm well past coffee. Kevin, great of you to join us today. Nice to see you. Sheila, yay, you've got power again. Sheila dealt with Hurricane Fiona last week. So glad you're still here to join us and that you've got internet and power back. That's awesome. Deb in Alaska, I've got your image, I think, as well. Oh, Mark was in Dominican Republic. Yeah, probably not a good place to be when the hurricane comes through the Caribbean. And Andrea, welcome. Is this your first time joining us, Andrea? I think I've seen you recognize your name once or twice before. So let me dig in here. I've got some images selected. We're trying to get a theme going. I had asked for birds and water and fall images, and I'm going to be working on some kind of fall-ish images today. So, well, welcome, Andrea. I'm glad you're joining us. Where did you find this, by the way? Because I just posted it in the Digital Photo Mentor group and on my wall and stuff. So maybe somebody shared it on Facebook, or I'd love to know how you found us. Calvin from Maine. Have you joined us before, Calvin? I seem to recognize your name, maybe not. Looks like you're skiing in your photo. We're hoping not ready for skiing weather yet here in Alberta. Soon enough. All right, so I've got some fall-ish pictures, and what I want to do is use Lightroom to bring out more of the fall colors, right? So I've got one of Stephanie's images. I do have your images, Deb, as well, but you, did you indicate? Yeah, you've got more of the birds. So we're going to save birds. Yeah, we've got your birds here, your eagle and your swan. So we're going to do birds another week, right? So we're going to do fall today. I've had this one of Marty's for a while, and while it's not specifically a fall image, it's kind of fall colors. So I want to bring out the texture in this wood. So what my goal is to bring out the subject. That's always the main goal of photo editing, is to make the subject pop. And in this case, can you tell what the subject is? Because you've got something that is in sharp focus and the rest is blurry. So generally the thing that's sharp should be your subject, right? So that's the first indicator. Anything else that's distracting, we want to minimize with the photo editing. So one of my tricks that I do is, I'm just going to take this into the develop module, is to look at the image upside down. Now, I'm using a lot of keyboard shortcuts here. If you're not familiar with the ones that I'm using here, you can get our free keyboard shortcuts PDF cheat sheet. It's a mouthful to say. Rob, if you could please put a link to that in the chat for those that are new. And yes, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat exactly where you are now. You're Nika. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the rest of your name, but absolutely pop your questions into the chat. Yes. Let's see. Did I miss any other questions? Easy method for HDR. We could potentially do an HDR themed evening. Yes, as well. Welcome from the Ozarks. Awesome. Just checked out the two free lessons on the Lightroom course. Excellent. Well, if you enjoyed them, this is a great supplement. I do this every 2 weeks. We're actually going to be possibly changing up the format and just mixing it up every week with Lightroom and Luminar, but you'll get some great tips by joining in here weekly as well. And we'll be moving to Saturday once we get more into sort of late fall here. All right, so the idea behind looking at this upside down, and I've got another one for you to share a link to, Rob, is my upside down trick video, is when you look at the image upside down, it actually tricks your eyes to see the things that your eye is going to be drawn to naturally right side up. Now, you may not need to do this because this is not your image, because what happens is when it's your image, your eyes go to the thing that you know that you photographed, right? But other people who weren't there with you when you photographed it, their eyes may go somewhere else. So then I use that information to guide my photo editing. So I look at the image upside down, and I don't have to do that anymore because I've been doing this a long time. But this is a trick that you can use to help you decide what to edit. Okay. So when we look at this image upside down, my eye is going to these little straw pieces here and this opening over here and these here. Okay. So the four things that draw your attention, I've mentioned a couple of them already. I'm just going to put them on the screen here for you. Okay. Oops, wrong four things. Where are we? Here we go. Okay, so those are the four things that will draw your attention. So I mentioned brightness, those little pieces of straw, right? Sharpness, I mentioned that as it goes to the subject, and contrast and color, okay? Specifically warm colors like orange, yellow, and red. So when you have those things in the background, your eye will be drawn there, okay? Now keep in mind that this whole image is mostly yellow and browns, right? So the keyboard shortcut I'm using to switch this and rotate it is Command or Control square bracket key, okay? If you're not familiar with that one. And there's a link in the chat if you want to download the keyboard shortcut. Okay. So now I know generally where I'm going to go with this image. Okay, so to get started, the first thing that I almost always do is change the camera profile. And in Lightroom, you can find that right here. Okay, if you just pull down the menu, you'll only see the Adobe ones. Okay, so if you want to see more, you can click Browse, or you can just click these little 4 squares or thumbnails there. Once you get into this panel, okay, you can see that there are camera matching profiles now. And just by hovering your mouse over, it'll show you a preview of what that one's going to look like. Portrait generally increases the amount of red. Landscape works really well on things with green and blue. And then, of course, you have standard, neutral, and faithful, which have a little bit less color, right? So in this one, I'm actually going to go with the landscape. Where am I? I might actually go with standard because it's a little bit more neutral and a little bit lower color, because what's going to happen is as soon as I start adjusting the other things, the color saturation is going to go up, and I almost never push the saturation slider to the plus side, almost never. Okay, so let me show you my little trick. when we look at the histogram here, and I make sure you have this viewable or turned on, okay, it tells me that there's a gap over here on the right, which means there's no white. There's nothing white in this picture. So if I want the information to touch the edge of the graph, I have a couple of different ways I can do that, okay? Whites is the thing I want to adjust because I want to push it over to the edge. So there's a little trick of shift, holding the shift key, and double click on the word whites. And look at that. It goes poof over to the right-hand side, okay? If I undo that, the other way I can do that is to literally grab in this area here, which is the whites, right? And just drag until it comes over to the side, okay? Like so. Now I'm going to adjust the exposure down a little bit. So exposure, the slider for exposure literally coordinates with the midtones, right? So if I put my mouse over the exposure slider, see in the histogram up in that corner there, I don't know if I can show it. No, I can't get it to highlight, sorry. You can see that it's sort of grayed out or the middle section, right? So the exposure is midtones. I'm going to bring the exposure or the midtones down a little bit. And then I want to make sure I have some nice blacks. So I'm going to do shift, double click on the blacks as well. Another keyboard trick is to hold down the Alt Option key when you're using these sliders, and that will give you an indication of anything that's clipping. With the white, I don't want to clip anything. So if you go too far, right, you're getting white with no detail, as indicated there, as you can see, right? So if I'm doing this manually, I take it up to get some clipping and then bring it down until there isn't any, okay? With the blacks, I do want to actually clip a little bit of black because look what happens to the color. Remember I said I don't touch the saturation slider? All you need is to deepen the blacks and you'll get more rich color in your image, okay? Now that I've done that, I'm just going to adjust the white balance. And because it's a raw file, you can see we've got all of the presets, like the camera presets. So I'm going to try daylight, which is a little bit less yellow. Okay, so that took out a bunch of the yellow. And usually I find the daylight preset works pretty well. And I usually dial the tint down a little bit to about 5 or 6, because usually it's too magenta, too much pink. Okay, so now just by changing the camera profile and a couple of sliders, we've gotten a lot more color and contrast. Okay. Now I'm going to do a crop. Okay, so I usually do cropping fairly early in the process because I want to eliminate this space down the bottom here. It's kind of bothering me. I'd like the fence to sort of just sit on the bottom of the image. So I'm going to come in and keep the aspect ratio. I can go free form and make it any shape. But if you want to keep the aspect ratio the same as the camera, you can either click this little lock here or just hold the shift key down when you're dragging it in. So by coming in a tiny little bit, now I've got the bottom of this part here on the edge of the image and here as well. So I'm not sure about that yet, if I want it tight on the edge or if I want a little bit of space there. So I'm going to go with that for now. Okay. And another thing that I might actually do is flip this image. Sometimes I will flip an image left to right, right, if it's more effective in terms of composition. And you can find that under the photo menu at the top and then flip, okay, like so. And in this case, I think this works better because your eye reads left to right and you come in this side and you sort of end up here. And ideally, we want the eye to sort of go back into this hole here. So partly that's why I cropped out this part here. I don't want them going back out of the image, your eye to go back out of the image. Okay. I'm going to do a vignette and I'm going to use one of my presets for that. I'm just going to use a low one. And what that does is it just adjusts the sliders in here in the effects panel. Okay. So I've just saved those as presets. Rob is back at his desk. So if you could please share a link to, what did I just do? Our presets, our Lightroom presets. So I see there's a couple of different questions here. So what is the most important part of photo editing? Basically, wedding photos. I'm a Bangladesh and a big fan. Well, welcome. Thank you for joining. The most important part of photo editing, in my opinion, and you may get different answers if you ask different photographers. The most important thing for photo editing, for my opinion, is to make the subject stand out. That is my goal, right? And to keep it natural looking. So if you've edited to the point of overdoing it, right? And I'm sure we'll come up upon an example where I'll show you what overdoing it looks like, right? I actually have a video on that if you want to pull that one up, Rob, the photo editing sins or what not to do. Is if you over edit, then the subject of the picture or where the viewer's eyes are going to go becomes the editing and not actually the subject of the picture. So when somebody looks at your image, you want them to say, wow, that is a fantastic photo of a fence in this example, or of a bride, not, oh, did you do some photo editing? You don't want that to be the first thing out of their mouths, okay? So keep the photo editing natural and make the subject stand out. I'll come back to your other question about which photo editing software to use. Okay, so my workflow is I use Lightroom as my catalog, my main catalog, and then I use Luminar Neo and some of the Topaz products as well when I want to do some finishing or to add some effects. Okay. So I'm just checking the ISO on this one to see if it needs any noise reduction. Okay, so it was at 250 ISO, so it shouldn't. Okay, let's just zoom in. Yeah, I don't see any noise here. This is at 60%. Looks pretty clean, okay? So I might want to add a little bit of details and sharpening, okay? And you can do that in the detail panel, okay? Keep in mind this masking slider is really important because I want to show you what happens when you take sharpening too far. So this is a good example of editing too far. So when we take the sharpening, all of these things to the extreme all the way to the right, okay? The radius is sort of how many pixels out from one pixel you're sharpening, okay? When you do that, I'm just going to go into 200%. Look what happens to the background, okay? So this background was completely blurry, and now we've just got this sort of pixelated mess, right? If I turn off the sharpening, see what that's doing? Okay, so we don't want to sharpen the background. So that's where this masking slider comes in. And when you hold down the Alt Option key again and increase the masking slider, you want to go up as high as about like this. So all you see is your subject with the outline white. So where you see white is where the sharpening is going to apply. Now, if I zoom back into 200% again, okay, we still got some weird pixelation happening here because of the numbers I've dialed in, but you notice the background is not being affected. So that's how important that masking slider is. Okay, now I'm just going to put these back to the default and dial the sharpening down a little bit. Okay, so I'm looking at this log here, and it could actually be sharper. So it's something that we could do, pulling it into Topaz. But see how now it's just affecting this area, the slider, and not the background. Okay, so the masking slider is really important, especially on especially when you're dealing with people, okay, because you don't want to sharpen the face. You'll literally sharpen the pores in their face and make them look more textured, which nobody's really happy about. Okay, the next tool I'm going to use is the HSL panel. Okay, and this allows me, you may see something that looks like this if you're showing all. I kind of like to just see one at a time, so I have it set like this, right? And when I'm working in this panel, what I want to do is affect certain colors. So I'm actually want to darken these yellows. So luminance is brightness, okay? And I could try just dialing down yellow. You can definitely see what it's doing, okay? We can also try orange. Okay, notice how there's quite a bit of orange in there as well. Or you can use this little thing. So you can use the sliders or click on this little targeted tool, and it kind of disconnects and you end up with this little this little thing that has sort of a circle and an up and down. So wherever you click and hold, drag up to increase, drag down to decrease, you can see it's affecting both of those sliders. Okay. And now remember how I said that this yellow stuff in the background was taking too much attention? And it's proving my point here also when I add black or darkness. Look how yellow is more intensified when it's darker. Okay. So if your colors are faded out, definitely you need some black or to darken your image. But I'm actually going to go to the brighter side here. Okay. So I'm actually going to brighten the background because your eye will go to the area of most contrast or the brightest area. And we're just going to deal with these things in the background here because this log is sharp and it's the darkest thing and it has the most contrast. So your eye will still go here. Okay. I am going to take the saturation down a little bit as well. Okay. But I want to be careful because doing so takes it out of the log. Okay. This might be a nice one for black and white as well. Okay. So I'm going to be careful I don't take too much color out so the log starts to fade out. This is one of my pet peeves about this tool in Lightroom is that you cannot mask this one because if I open up any of the masking tools, okay, I'll just select one, for example. I'm just going to do select subject. Let's see what it picks. Okay, so that's not bad. I can do select subject, but I don't have those HSL sliders. Okay. While I'm in here, since I've got it selected, I'm actually going to increase the texture and maybe the clarity. Okay. Clarity always adds a little bit of black, as does dehaze. Okay. So dehaze is kind of the same as adding the black slider. So I'm going to add some texture and clarity. And I might actually increase the saturation a bit here because I've sort of lowered it using the other sliders. Okay. Then I'm going to do the same thing or opposite on the background. So I'm going to first name this mask. So this is fence post. And then using the little 3 dots, I'm going to duplicate and invert this mask. Okay, so masking allows me to do adjustments on part of the image only. And now that we've got basically the background selected, I'm going to lower the highlights and maybe bring the exposure down a little bit. And then I can also lower the texture if I want to blur things a little bit more, as well as the clarity. So now we're really forcing the eye to come to this part. Okay. Maybe a little too dark. I'm actually going to increase the shadows. So I'm trying to lower the contrast in this area because when I darken it, I don't want this dark line in the background showing. Okay. I'll show you another way we can fix that as well. So let's do it before and after. Okay. So we've got lots more contrast and punch in this fence post now. Okay. All right, I mentioned this line here. So it's kind of bothering me as well as this thing, as well as these little pieces of the grass sticking up. So ideally, I would go to Photoshop to use the cloning tools there. But let's see what we can do with the healing brush here inside of Lightroom. Okay. When you have it up to 100% opacity, I'm just going to get a slightly larger brush. So my brush is just slightly wider than this little stick thing here. I'm going to select my source off to the side. Lightroom doesn't do a good job here. Sorry, I was using Luminar cloning earlier. I'm going to paint over this thing, and then I'm going to select the source off to the side here. And when I have it set to 100%, Lightroom does its job and just completely removes it. Okay, so it blends it all the way out. So I'm going to get rid of that one completely. Okay. I'm going to make sure the feather is high and make sure it's blended. That looks pretty good. Something like that. Okay, now this one up here, I'm going to paint over this dark area. But this time I'm just going to dial it down because all I want to do is lighten it a little bit. And I'm just going to lower it to about 40%. Okay. And the same with this entire strip across here. So you can use the clone or the healing tool to lighten or darken things a tiny bit. Okay. So see how that's getting rid of that or minimizing that dark spot in the middle there. Okay. Actually, I'll move that up a little bit so it's a little bit smoother. Somewhere in there. So it allows you to paint in, and then you can move the spot once you've painted. I might need a slightly wider one here or a little bit better feather. Okay. And I might need to do it twice. So let's do one more pass here. Okay, so I did 2 passes, and I could put the source at the same spot, like so. Okay, you don't want to overlap over here because it'll start to get blurry. The blending is not going to go so well if you're overlapping this log. So I have to be careful of that. Okay, so see, it's just kind of minimizing that dark area in the background. Okay. And I'll do the same with these guys here. I don't need to be at 200%. Let's go back to about 66%. So I'm going to use the same trick again, or the same tool, and just paint over it. And I want to see how good a job Lightroom does. So I want to line it up about like that. So I'm making sure to line up sort of this like divot here. Okay. You want to be careful of repeating patterns, right? See how there's this triangular pattern in here and it's repeating it here, right? That's a key indicator that you've done some cloning. So be careful of repeat patterns. Okay. I want to try and get it to blend a little better. That looks pretty good. Okay, so it's getting rid of that piece of grass. Okay. So it did a pretty good job. So even though Photoshop's tools are more powerful, you can actually do quite well with the cloning tools in Lightroom. Okay. It often picks like a weird spot to clone from, but I can just move it down. Now let me show you the trick here. Okay, so when I'm going over the edge, you want to match up the edge of the log so that the colors blend. Okay, I'm looking in this area here while I'm moving this. See that? That looks like a good blend. Then I can do the next section. So I always do the edge separately. And again, I want to get a decent blend on the blacks there. Let's try over here. See, I'm trying to blend that dark area. That's not bad. That's better. Okay, and one more. So it took me 3 or 4 to get rid of this little stick. Okay. Is it perfect? No, but it's pretty good. If we zoom out, I could do better on this bottom one here. But unless you're looking really hard for it, you probably won't notice it, right? All right. So before and after, the only other thing that I might do with this one is do another mask and do a graduated filter. Okay, so that, or a linear, they call it linear now. It used to be called graduated. And I'm just going to come in from this side, but I'm actually going to add a second one, right? And come in from this edge as well, because I want to darken everything except this log. Okay, see how I'm just bringing the highlights down a little bit. And I'm also going to bring the saturation down, because as I darken, See how the saturation comes up. Okay. See what that's doing? And I could also lower the texture again if I want less texture and blur it out even more. So I'm fairly happy with that, minimizing some of the distractions, bringing your focus over here. And now I could revisit this cropping and say, okay, I might want a little more space over here. I think that's better. So I went off aspect ratio, and I think it's better to have a little bit of space over here, right? I'm noticing a little bit of a color fringe here, ever so slightly, and that's going to be under the lens corrections panel, that chromatic aberration. Let me zoom in even further here. Can you see what I'm seeing if I turn it off? See that little tiny red fringe there? It's very subtle, but it actually makes your image less sharp. Okay, so almost always I check off that box. Okay? And that's something that you can actually save as a Lightroom preset. Okay. Okay. Let's see about the next image then. If we want to do two versions of an image, you have the ability to do a virtual copy in Lightroom as well. So I mentioned black and white. So if I want to do a virtual copy, we can just do Command apostrophe, and that makes another copy. Okay. Let's change my background color here. There we go. So I'm not used to the black background. So now I've got a virtual copy, and all that's done is made another thumbnail. So it hasn't duplicated the image, okay? So it's not taking up any more space on your hard drive. All you need to do is make a copy with a virtual copy and then choose black and white, okay? You want to make sure that you get the Adobe monochrome, okay, and not the camera monochrome, because if we choose the camera monochrome one and we close it, now we don't have anything here to apply any sliders under the monochrome, okay? So we want to use Adobe monochrome, because then instead of the color tool or HSL, we have black and white mix, right? That allows us to adjust how the tones are blended, right? And I was right, this one looks pretty good in black and white. The key to good black and white, and I know this is a question that Kevin and I have been talking about, is you need to have black. Okay, so make sure you have some good blacks, even deeper and more contrast. Okay, you can use the contrast slider, or if you're in Luminar, you can use the smart contrast slider in Develop. Okay, make sure you have good contrast. So that means whites and blacks. Okay, so there's the color. And there's the black and white. Okay. I would probably continue doing some cloning out to get rid of these things over here on the left. And they're not so distracting here in black and white, but in the color version, these little straws here, these little bits still bother me, right? Okay. Let's take a look at the next one. Yes, it will be early for you, Trish. The issue is that we have to change it up because right now we're not getting the Europeans, right? So unfortunately, half of the year we leave Europe out and half the year we leave Australia out. And, you know, those times work for us. So unless I'm doing something at 1 a.m. my time, it's impossible to get Europe and Australia. So I'm not doing such good editing at 1 in the morning, at least not teaching anyway. Sometimes I do edit at 1 in the morning. So let's move on to the next image. If there's any questions about that or anything I covered there, is Stephanie in the house, Rob? I haven't seen her today. No. Is she? Is Stephanie here? I've seen Sheila. No, I didn't see Steph. Okay, so I'm going to work on this one, and I'll just let Stephanie know that I've done this one because I asked her a couple weeks ago if I could hold on to it because it's a really nice fall image and it's got some really neat potential here. Okay, so let's take this one into the develop module because this is where we can really start to work with the HSL panel and to bring out some of those colors. Okay, looking at the histogram, she's got a beautiful exposure, really nice. There's nothing clipping here except the little white bits of the sky, so no concern. Got some nice colors. So let's work with, again, the camera profile, and let's see what happens when we choose landscape this time. Okay, so notice how it actually changed it quite a bit. Okay, faithful is less colorful, neutral looks a bit greener, standard, and then portrait. So ironically, landscape seems to add more orange even than portrait, right? So I'm going to go back to, I'm just going to go back to Adobe for a moment, just so we can see the difference. Okay, so landscape, orange, portrait seems to be more yellowy orange, green, orange, and even standard looks pretty good, right? I'm actually going to go with the standard, and then we're going to play with the white balance again. So this time I'm going to try cloudy. It's going to go pretty warm, okay? But it didn't change all that much from where it was, right? See, look, I haven't touched the sliders yet. And just changing that profile already adds a little bit more contrast and color, okay? Then I'm going to do shift, double click. Right? Now the white slider went all the way to -100, and it did that because of those whites in the sky. So I'm going to do this one manually using the Alt option, so I can see which parts of the image are clipping. So I'm not worried about the sky. Okay, so I'm actually going to bring it up a little bit. I can bring the highlights back down. Right? So I want to make sure that there's nice highlights everywhere else. So I'm not worried about the sky. These little bits aren't really that distracting. Okay. Let's give it a bit of clarity. I usually go between 10 and 15 for landscape images like this overall, and then we could start to work at some individual or masking bits of the image, okay? Now, the question that I would have for Stephanie is, it looks like she's used F10, so she's got a nicer depth of field, right? And a 30th of a second, but my question is, did she use a tripod? Now I won't know that, okay? The image looks nice and sharp, but it's got some grain because of the high ISO, right? So if you were using a tripod, okay, so if you're watching this later, Stephanie, if you're using a tripod, keep the ISO low, like 200, and then just let the shutter speed go longer, okay? And unless you're worried about things moving, okay, you'll get the water moving, which is fine. You might get the leaves rustling or moving a little bit. And it looks like maybe there's a leaf moving there. It looks like there's a spider web. Can you see that? Right? So you might get some movement of things, but you won't get that noise. Okay. And we can get rid of some noise using Topaz or something like that as well. Okay. Okay, so we've got that. Let's just play with the color a little bit. So I want to dial this down because I feel like it's almost too orange. Right? I could try the eyedropper, which is the white balance targeted tool, if I think that this thing is white, okay? Because you have to click on something that's neutral color. So let's just see what happens, right? That's actually not too bad, right? It took a lot of that yellow out, but I think it was falsely too yellow. So I'm going to go somewhere in between with a little bit less pink, right? So based on that as being neutral, I think that's a better color, right? I can always increase it if I feel like it's gone too far. I'm going to crop this image a little bit because the thing that bothers me here, and I want to talk about why I'm doing this, is this space on the other side of the tree. Okay, so the tree being on the edge of the frame makes a nice anchor, but then there's this little gap over here that's kind of just drawing your eye, or it can. So I'm just going to get rid of that by coming into the tree. Now there's a gap up there, so I can decide to come in a little farther, which is not a bad idea. Okay. Now, do I want to leave this aspect ratio because I've cropped in from the original, or do I want to come in a little farther? I think I want to leave it or come in from the bottom. So I like where the river's ending, sort of in the corner here. We could come in a tiny bit from the bottom, but be careful of cropping into things, right? So like if I come in a little bit here, you'll see that it's cutting off the bottom of this leaf, right? So I don't want to do that. I want to leave the whole leaf. And if I come in too far on the top, then we start to cut off this arch of this little lantern thing here, okay? So I might come in a little bit. If I'm worried about the original aspect ratio, you can always get it back here and then just keep your aspect ratio locked when you do your crop. Okay, something like that. So remember, I'm keeping that edge of the tree. Oops, like that. Okay, so we got rid of those bits on the edge, and now the tree is a really nice anchor on this side. Okay. The one thing that kind of does bother me is that this thing is facing out of the picture here, right? So I do want to see what happens if I flip this one this way. Right? Because now my eye sort of comes in here, follows this arch, and we sort of end up over here. Still not sure. I feel like this is competing with the tree for subject matter. I wish this thing was pointing the other way so that it was actually facing the tree, but it's not. So we're going to work with it the way it is. Right? So that's the basic panel. Right? Now, as I move down, I want to add a vignette again. So I'm just going to do that in the panel here. Excuse me. Right, so I'm just going to drag down. And remember, vignette always comes from the edges and is always centered in Lightroom. You can't off-center it. So if you want it off-centered, you need to use a radial mask. Right, so I take the feather down. And in this case, I'm actually just going to leave it and just pull it in like so. So I'm not going to change any of the defaults other than that. When you're using highlight or color priority, it changes sort of the look of the outer part of the vignette. I find color priority is a little bit usually lighter or softer. And if you drag this slider up, let me go to highlight priority and I'll show you what happens here. So if we go extremely dark, okay, it's darkening everything equally. Whereas if you bring the highlights up, it starts to bring these little highlights back, right? Because it looks more realistic because the sun would still be poking through those holes, right? So we could go highlight priority or we can go color priority. In this case, I think I like highlight priority better. So remember, you want to keep your vignettes natural looking. So always keep the feather over 50. It's very rare that I'd want to have a feather down here. And you don't want to do stuff like that, okay? If you can tell that there's a vignette on it, again, you don't want people to look at your picture and say, oh, did you darken the edges? Oh, I think you used the vignette. You want them to look at the picture and just enjoy the scene, okay? Somewhere in there. All right, we don't need to transform. I'm not too worried about this being perfectly straight, but now we are going to go into that HSL panel again. So this is where we get to do some really cool stuff because of these colors in this image, right? So I could brighten the yellows and darken the oranges and give the leaves sort of more texture, right? I could darken the greens or lighten the greens. Actually, darkening the greens makes the oranges stand out more. Okay, so we can darken the green a little bit. And I take these two extremes, right? So just to see what it's doing. So I'm going to darken the green a little bit. Let's see what red is doing. Okay, red is on the path. Okay, so look what happens when I darken red. It actually gives a little bit more contrast on this path area here. Doubt that there's much blue. Oh, look, there's blue here and blue in the water. So if I brighten it, it actually brings that highlight up, which is kind of a nice thing. Okay. Aqua, nothing. There's probably not much of these either. So this is my process. I literally go all the way and just see what they're doing. Okay, so those ones aren't doing anything. I'm going to leave them as is. Now the same thing applies here. Okay, so we can increase the saturation of yellow or decrease. Orange or decrease. So I think I want to give a little bit more orange and yellow. Not a lot of red. And let's play with the greens. What happens if we do yellow but lower orange? Sometimes I will do that, right? I'll do a balance where I'll increase one and decrease the other. Let's give a little bit more green. So turning that off and on. See how it just changes? Like, let's look at the leaves here. Right? Let me come in a little bit closer. Look at the leaves on this tree here. So when I turn it off, right, you see how it just changes the lighting on them almost, right? So we get more texture and the path is changing as well, okay? So I'm pretty happy with that, right? Now we could also do color grading on this image, right? If we want to add more color into the highlights, for example, maybe the leaves aren't yellow enough, you could actually use this set to highlights. See that? And add more yellow into the highlights. See? Give it a little more. And you can also even use it to brighten them. Okay, so you can brighten the highlights using the luminance slider. So this color grading tool is useful for color manipulation as well, not just color grading a black and white or making a cinematic sort of color graded look. Okay. As far as Lightroom goes, that's about it for what I would do in here. And then I would take this image over to Luminar and do probably a demystify or something like that. Okay. If we want to get into doing dodging and burning and take it a little farther, we can use masking tools here in Lightroom. Okay. And I demonstrated this in the Luminar Neo course using the develop tool. This is the same way to do it in Lightroom. So using a brush, right? And what I want to do is I'm going to increase the exposure, increase the whites, increase the highlights, which is going to brighten wherever I'm painting, right? I'm just going to close this panel so the image can be a little bigger here. Okay. Then I want to get a soft brush. Okay, so feather, fairly high, but a smaller brush. I'm going to make my brush smaller. I'm going to turn this thing off so you can actually see my brush. I'm not sure if you can see the brush. Can you see how small my brush is right here in the margin here? Okay. And with the exposure higher, this is called dodging or lightening. Okay. And I'm going to use the density to about 20%. So all I'm going to do is brighten up certain areas. Okay. So anything that is already light, I'm bringing more attention to it. Okay. So all I'm doing is sort of painting over these already highlighted areas to bring them out a bit more. See what that's doing? I'm not going to do this one in the water here because I don't want to bring attention to it. So I'm going to leave that one. I could also get the edges of the trees here. And this is something that you can spend a fair bit of time on because these are the kinds of things that landscape photographers do to take their images to the next level. Okay, so they don't just slap on a preset and call it a day. Okay, so I'm just doing the edges of things. You see what's happening here. Now this guy's in the road, so I can just move him like this. All right, so I'm not going to do the whole image. I want you to get an idea. And I'm looking for, this is also really helpful to train your brain to see highlights and shadows like this. So I'm going to rename this one Lighten. If you can't remember which is dodge and which is burn, just call it Lighten. Right? Then I'm going to create another one with a brush again. And then this time I'm going to darken the exposure, bring the blacks down and the shadows down. Okay, notice I did all three things each time, not just exposure, because I'm adjusting the exposure, the shadows, the midtones, the shadows and the blacks here. And then on the whites, I was affecting the midtones, the highlights, and the whites. Okay, so now I'm doing the same, and I want to darken the areas that are already dark. Okay, so if I want to give this more contrast, anytime you paint in with darkness like this, you're basically adding shadows. Okay, so especially in a scene where it's fairly low contrast because the lighting is soft, you're actually creating more contrast. Okay, you'll see when I turn these off what it's doing. Okay, so notice that I painted part of the trunk lighter. Right, I did the bottom of the branch or the top of the branch lighter. I do the bottom of the branch, right, and then get into these little areas. So I'd spend a fair bit of time doing all of this to create this type of lighting, and then head over to Luminar to add some finishing touches like Mystical. Okay, that's one of my favorite things. It's kind of this little blur filter. And for those of you that are not familiar with Luminar, I'll show a demonstration. Now notice that I didn't lighten this little bit in the middle of the river here because I thought these leaves were drawing too much attention. Okay, so I can actually darken them instead. Okay, so I'm just burning. So darkening is called burning. Okay? And I'm doing it at a low opacity because each pass over an area adds a tiny bit more darkness, right? Okay, so now I'm just going to rename this one, darken, and let me just turn off the mask so you can see what's happening. Okay, so ready, before and after. Okay, see how it's really sort of, look at the fern and this area in here. It's really creating highlights that weren't there. Okay. Let's see. Trish says, do you prefer the dodge and burn to use dodge and burn in Lightroom or Luminar? Honestly, exactly the same, Trish, because when I do it in Luminar, I'm using the develop tool, and it basically has the same tools that I have here in Lightroom. So it's exactly the same. So it really just depends on which tool you like using better. I could do the same thing with the dodge and burn layer in Photoshop. Okay, so they're all just different ways of getting to the same result. Okay. And let's see. Does the shepherd's crook angle bug me? The fact that it's sort of leaning. Could you apply the tool from the transform panel using vertical lines to set it? I could try, Sheila, but I don't know that that's the issue because this line is in the middle of the picture. I don't know if that's going to help. Let's just see what it thinks. Okay, if I do vertical, yeah, see, it's not really doing anything, right? I could try guided, which allows me to drag a line here, but then what am I going to also say is straight up and down, right? Because if I say, well, this tree is straight up and down, that's what's going to do. Okay, so it's going to try and straighten it that way, and it's not going to work, right? Even if I constrain the crop, it's just distorting the lantern, okay? So I'm going to say no on that one. Now, I undid, but I'm not sure if I undid correctly. So I'm just going to go back in the history and find out, go back to before I applied that, just to make sure I'm not stretching or it doesn't change my crop. Okay. Trish says, I need to practice dodge and burn more. It does take some time, and you can definitely see how it's working really nicely here. So I do want to finish this up in Luminar. So again, if I'm just doing finishing touches, I have a workflow where I will just go directly to Neo, which I'm going to do here. If I want to do more extensive editing, or if I think I want to do anything else, if I wanted to do the cloning in Photoshop, then I would take it to Photoshop and use it as a smart object as well first, right? Oh, see, and Linton likes the angle of the crook. It's artistic. Aha. Okay, so one person's crooked is another person's artistic. There you go. Okay, Luminar is opened on my other monitor. Let me just resize it so I can fit it over here. Ugh, I got to figure out how to get out of Lightroom. Full screen. There we go. Okay. I went into full screen mode and then I couldn't get out of it. Okay, so here I am, and I'm not going to do any presets because I literally, well, we could actually even try one, right? Not sure why it thinks urban style. I'm going to look at sort of my favorite ones. Forest Stream is one of the ones, and this happens to be a Forest Stream. So let's see what Forest Stream does. Okay, look at that. Intensify the colors for sure. Okay. Warming sun, I'm guessing is going to be warming. And these are just ones that I found that I liked, right? So if we want to go really warm, that's kind of a neat idea. I think this one changes the sky. I'm not sure. No, also pretty warm. Okay, so these ones are pretty over the top, and I wish that they had the slider like they used to have in Luminar AI to just dial the effect down. And also, something that I just want to mention is that there is a new update that's out today. And if you are using Luminar Neo and you had Luminar AI before, they now have the migration tool available. So you can actually migrate. I'm not going to do this now. I'll do an install of this afterwards, and I'll make a video showing how to do that as well, and you'll find that on the channel. And if you're in the Luminar Neo course, of course, I'll be doing another video on that as well. So if you do have Luminar AI, and I believe you will be able to convert your old presets and templates and things as well. Okay, so that is a good update. I just wish I had a little bit more notice with it than it just came out today. So I'm going to undo these presets. And I'm just going to go into the tools because I know what I want to apply here. Okay, so I know that I am going to apply either Mystical or one of the glow tools. I find Mystical works better on landscapes. See, look at that where I dodged and burned, right? You can really see that it's working to enhance that, okay? So if I want to go quite far with this, but not make it so soft, just dial the smoothness down a little bit. Let's just take that, okay? And then shadows, I can increase the shadows with this tool, okay, as well. So I can really kind of push that up. See how it just makes the leaves sort of glow, right? It feels, I don't know, it just feels more sort of ethereal. Now, if I wanted part of the image to not glow, for example, this little bird thing, I think it's a bird thing. I guess it's a lantern, right? It would be a lantern. I can just mask it off a little bit and just erase using erase. Okay, remember, if your tool shows the negative thing in the middle now, it's erase. Press X and it's now paint. Okay, so it's easy to see if you're erasing or painting. Let's keep that sharp too. Okay, so literally I've just made these two things sharp and everything else sort of mystical, for lack of a better term. Okay. So I'm going to apply that. Right. And then I want to see the comparison with glow. So I'm going to apply glow on top, and I'm just going to try and make some guessing here. If I use glow, what it does is it makes the highlights, the already bright areas, brighter, okay? And it sort of fuzzes them out. So it's kind of like a fog, right? Which could be neat in the background here, because then it gets rid of that problem of the sky, right, being blown out. We can just sort of fog it out. Okay? So that's kind of cool, actually. Or I wanted to compare Orton effect. Okay, so obviously that's too strong. I tend to like the demystify better than Orton effect for landscape. I don't know why. I just prefer that look. Right? So I'm going to go with glow, and I'm going to actually I could darken. Let's glow a little bit more. See how that's really affecting the sky areas. And again, if I want to mask out so I'm not getting it on this guy here, we just use the erase tool. Okay. You can also make sure that other bits are not glowing if I want to keep them masked off. Okay, so it's just affecting this part of the sky up here and adding like a little fog. Right? If we want fog, we can go to the atmosphere tool as well, which is kind of cool. Right? And some of them add fog from the top down, and some of them go in the middle, right? Like it looks like it's over the river here kind of thing. Mist and haze. So haze is actually kind of cool. It looks like it's sort of in the valley, right? And again, if I want to just have it be foggy, like it's a nice sort of fall morning. And once again, I should have copied this mask because I've painted it in like 3 or 4 times, right? So I should have just copied it. So I'm erasing off the lantern again. And I'm just doing like a really sort of quick and dirty mask. And I'm going to keep it off the bridge as well, okay, a little bit. So I just want the fog in the valley. See that? So now we have a little bit of fog in the valley. I'm going to do a bigger brush and just do a sort of pass over here. Like that. So I'll see a before. This is what we brought from Lightroom. And that's where I'm at now in Luminar. Okay. Another cool filter that they have in here is the super contrast. Oh, we could try also color harmony, which is a really cool one. Okay, so under color contrast, this amount slider here allows me to play with the contrast of the colors. And if I'm doing this one, for example, I can actually affect the greens a little bit, which is kind of nice. And then super contrast, which allows me to darken the highlights. And if I want to deal with that sky, okay, we're now sort of getting over the fog. So we did the fog instead of working with the highlights. I like the fog. I kind of like the fog. Maybe the fog needs to come over a little bit more. Let's get rid of that one. I think the fog needs to come forward a little bit more. There we go. Let's just check the mask. Like so. Okay, so you can see how I'm really sort of playing with this fog. And I wanted it to be down in this valley a little bit more. Like that. Keeping the fog. Oops, see, I'm painting. Should have been erasing. Should have been erasing. Trying to get these little sticks here. Not doing a perfect job. Okay. See, I used the wrong brush. And then we have our fog. So let's apply it and go back to Lightroom. Okay. In terms of correcting the distortion, I'm glad you showed me how. I thought the correct would be just affected. That's not the case. No, it's going to stretch the whole image because that's how those distortion controls work. And that's why you have that constrained crop thing, because it will crop off part of the image when it stretches it. Okay? Karen, when an image has an area such as sun burning through the fog, which causes the whites to be blown out, does it make a bad image? Not necessarily. And that's one of the things that's actually really cool about Luminar is if you have that, There's a sun rays tool in Luminar that you can actually add the sun rays and go with it. Okay, so instead of trying to erase it, you can add the sun rays coming in, and you can actually add contrast that way as well. Okay, so here is now the Lightroom. Let me just do a copy, another virtual copy. And I'm going to show you the before, total before. Just do a reset on this one. There we go. All right, so here are the 3 edits. So this one is the original, Lightroom edit, and after Luminar, right? Now, you could do those same things in Photoshop if you know how to add a layer that's doing the lightness and the blurring. There's various different blurs and filter effects in Photoshop as well. Okay? Andrea. Yes, Luminar Neo replaced Luminar AI several months ago, and they announced that Luminar AI is now a dead product. When they originally announced Luminar Neo, it was about a year ago. They said they would support Luminar AI for a year, so they've been true to their word. But now Luminar AI is not available anymore, and it will not receive any more updates. So if you have Luminar AI, if you have the latest version, that's it. There's no more. But if you have Luminar AI, you're actually missing out on quite a few tools. Some of the things that have been added are background replacement. What else do we have? Background replacement. So have the same portrait tools, I believe. But we have things like the erase dust spots, erase power lines. If you come next week to this same live editing, I'll be doing Luminar Neo exclusively, and I'll show you the tools inside of Luminar Neo, and you get a better idea. Or if you want to preview actually the first 2 lessons in my Luminar Neo course, can you share a link for her if you're back in your office, Rob, to the preview of the 2 Luminar Neo course lessons? Because then it'll give you an idea of the overview of Luminar Neo and what's in it. Okay. Neo was panned by some photographers when it was first announced, so you avoided buying it. It's been out since February, and it's actually quite good. And this last update, which was 1.4, we saw the clone tool added, so there's nothing that's missing anymore. And I would definitely recommend that you update. They do have models now of what to buy in terms of what am I looking for here? I'm looking for a link for you. You can now buy it outright still, or you can get an annual subscription, which gives you always up to date. That's our link to buy it. If you use that link, we do get a small credit. And if you use the code DPM Neo, if you purchase the annual version, so you want the upgrades every year, that will give you a discount on the annual version. So check that out. And then Rob has put a link into the course preview for you below. All right, so let me get back here. I think we have time for one more, and I'm going to do a quick edit. These ones sort of really aren't fall-y, but they had some images that they had some colors that were fall-like, right? So we're kind of, going off the savannah here. Looks like something out of Africa. And this is a JPEG, okay? So I have limited amount of what I can do here. I'm going to start with the basic panel, and you'll notice that if I go into this color profiles, there is nothing for camera. Okay, so I'm just going to go with the Adobe one, and I'm going to adjust the whites and the blacks, and you can see what happened there because there's lots of black in the tree, and it's clearly crooked. So I'm going to straighten it using the crop tool just by clicking auto, right? And it did a pretty good job. The other way to do that is to grab this little ruler here and just select the horizon. So drag from one end to the other, and it will straighten it. Okay. Now, there's not really much to do to this image because it's pretty simple. So I might actually go in and do a sky replacement. So for that, you would need to use Photoshop or Luminar, right? Let's see if we can darken the sky a little bit. So I'm going to darken the sky. And you see what happens? This is called banding, right? So because this is a JPEG, I don't have a raw file to do full detail on, right? So when I try and pull the blues darker, this is, you see the sort of stripes here and it's all pixelated. The stripes is what's called banding. And whenever you get that, it'll show up in the sky quite frequently when you edit too much. Okay, so that's an indicator of over editing, banding. Okay, so I can try and bring the blues down a little bit, but I'm not going to go too far. I'm going to try select sky and see if that does a decent job. Now I could do the same thing here and bring the exposure down. That does a better job and it looks like it's a little bit smoother. Okay, and you can also add some color. Let me put this mask tool back up here. If you go to the bottom here, you can adjust the color, using these sliders, right? You can make it more blue or more yellow, or you can go down here and just choose a color. So if I want to sort of make a purpley blue sky somewhere in there, I can literally just paint the sky blue, okay, with this tool right there. So there's not much more to do here. I might tend to come in a little bit on this one because there's not much interest, right? In terms of what's in the sky and or in the bottom. And we can also crop these trees out on the horizon. I did crop out one of them. But see how they just look like lumps, right? So we could use the cloning tool here again. Okay, so if I use the cloning or healing tool, I'm going to select this tree and it did a pretty good job. Yeah, so why it's making it white is a good question. It should just clone it out. That looks better. Okay, so see how I can just get rid of that. And I could get rid of all these little lumps on the horizon that way. Okay, make sure you line up the horizon straight. I would probably go in and, there's bottles and things here. Definitely clean up some of this garbage. And for that, you might want to go to Photoshop. Okay, so it's a little bit more extensive cleaning up in terms of cloning out bottles and things. Okay. So that's a really simple image. That might be something if you do composites that could become a background for you. But otherwise, there's not much really to do with it, right? Oh, which one doesn't line up? The 8s line up. The link that you got it, Rob? Okay. Yeah, what was missing there? It looks like the same link. Don't you already have the Luminar Neo course, Mark? All right, so that's fall pictures. Let's just call these ones done. Right? Maybe we do have time for one more quick one. I've had this one for a while. This is, I'm not even sure whose image this is. I think this might be Regan's. And it's kind of neat, right? There's some neat shapes and things happening here. This sort of thing, this thing in the background here, let me turn my cursor back on. This thing in the background here is a little bit distracting, okay? And I'm curious what Lightroom would think is the subject if I choose subject on a mask here. So this is a JPEG. So again, I'm not going to be able to do camera profile. And I'm going to let this part clip because I'm going to deal with that separately. So I'm just doing the whites and the blacks. Now, when you have an image where it's really blurry in the background like this, you don't want to use a lot of texture and clarity because it's affecting the background as well. Okay, so that's why you don't want to do these things globally more than a tiny little bit. Okay, because it affects things everywhere. I'm going to brighten this up a little bit. And I might warm it up, but I'm still like the amount of blue that's in there, actually. Let's work with sky. Okay, so let's see what it thinks is subject. So we'll go select subject. Oh, that's not bad. That's not bad. Okay, so it's chosen. And again, I'm guessing how Lightroom's engine works underneath, right? How its algorithm works is it's looking for the stuff that's already sharp. Okay, so now I can add texture and clarity and maybe boost exposure. But you see what's happening? It does definitely have a halo around it. So be careful because the selection that Lightroom did is not perfect. Okay. If I want to perfect it, I'd have to go in with the brush, or I could try deleting or subtracting luminance range. Okay. So see how it's selecting those bright areas. So I want to make sure it's just deselecting those areas. Yeah, now we have a little better selection. See that? So what I did was I took the subject, and then the luminance range I chose was these bright areas, right? And it got rid of sort of some of the glow around them. Okay. And I might give them a bit more yellow. Let's make them a little bit warmer as well. Now I'm going to call this plant. I'm going to use that duplicate and invert again. Okay, it's really handy. Because now I'm going to pull down the highlights and see. Remember I said we deal with that part in the background. So now I can pull down the highlights, lower the texture, lower the clarity, and we're dealing with more of a blur in the background now, and take the sharpness all the way down as well if I want. Okay. So now we can see what those masks are doing. Okay. So that's really highlighting these little guys here. I'm going to not brighten them up quite so much. Okay. And if I want to take the sky farther, I can do one more and select sky, cross my fingers to see if it's done a good job. Not bad. Yeah, not bad. Okay, so now I can add some more blue. I can bring the highlights and the exposure down. And we can just add some blue. There we go. Okay. So the blue, cool colors recede and warm colors project. Okay, so making those little plants warmer, they're already sharp, and making the background bluer helps them to stand out more. Okay. I'm going to apply one of my develop presets. I'm going to apply, actually, strong vignette works pretty well on this one. And I'm going to crop it a tiny little bit because I'm finding these dark corners here are bothering me. And there's a little bit much down the bottom here. Okay, so I'm going to come in from the bottom and come in a little bit on that side and a little bit on this side. I have no idea what aspect ratio this is. And personally, I don't care. I just like to crop as the image dictates. Okay. This sort of weird thing in the corner is bugging me, so I'm going to see if I can use the clone tool to lighten it a little bit. Yeah, see, doesn't want to do that. See, it's picking up the edge. This one might require Photoshop to lighten that area a little bit. Okay. So there's a really quick edit on this one before. The issue, if we look at it upside down, right? The issue on the before is what? The background is so bright that the subject is almost lost except for the part where it's silhouetted against the white, right? And then when we look at the after, right? This is still a tiny little bit bright here, and I could work on that one a little bit more, right? So let's go back right side up and do that with a linear gradient. So I'm going to come down from the top. And the linear gradients always come from the edge. We'll lower the highlights again. See, when I do the exposure, it darkens everything. just going to lift the shadows because I really want to lower the contrast of that area. And I could even give it some more blue. That looks pretty good. Now this thing over here is really bugging me, but I'm just going to crop it out. See that weird thing in the corner? It just bugs me. Something like that. Funny Sheila, I just did that. She says, how about a crop from the top right corner? I just did that, and I'm still not happy with that little blobby thing up there. I would probably go to Photoshop and get rid of it, or to Luminar Neo. Okay. Okay. Oh, your NordVPN was blocking something. That's interesting. Interesting. Okay. Depending if you're using a VPN and you go to a site like Skylimes, for example, for Neo, if you're using, like if you're in the US and you're using, say, a British VPN or UK VPN, it might recognize you as being there and give you the wrong pricing. Okay. So yeah, make sure when you're on a site that charges in your currency that you're actually on your own DNS, your own host. Any other questions about what I did on this one? It's a pretty straightforward edit, right? But look at the difference before and after. And if we want to get creative with color and things, this is where you can now go into these profiles and look at some of these other ones. Okay, so we can look at, for example, ooh, look at that, vintage. Does everything we want. Look at that. Boom. Right? That one's softer, shifting the colors. These are actually really nice on these, right? So working with the edits that I already have done and these vintage camera profiles, one of these is actually really nice. A matte black. Look at how neat that is, right? It's kind of really highlighting this flower or whatever it is against this light area of the background. That one too. These are very similar. This one's got a little bit more green. Okay, so those are kind of cool. Let's see the modern ones. Right, more color, same kind of idea, but more color. That one's all red. I kind of like this vintage one. I'm going to go with vintage. Okay, and what it's doing, you can do this kind of look yourself in the tone curve as well. It's basically pushing the blacks up so that you don't have pure black. Okay. If you could please share the video I did on using the tone curve, I explained that in that video. So I'm going to end here. And we're actually talking about our Luminar Neo course, but we do have a Lightroom course as well. And I know that some or all of you are already enrolled in it. And I posted it in your group, so you may see that in the Facebook group. So if you would like to see more Lightroom tips, the Lightroom course is very in-depth. How many lessons do we have now? Something like, how many lessons do we have, Rob? I think 48 or something lessons. And it's something around 14 or 20 hours of material, including the Q&As, which were done with live Zoom calls with the students. So check that out. And if you would like to participate and send in your images, please do so, because I am almost out again. So we've done fall. I would love to have a few more bird images and a few more water images for Lightroom. Okay, so next week is going to be Luminar Neo. And if you're using Luminar Neo, I will be probably doing fall or birds, because I've got a couple of options, both of those, whichever I get the most submissions for. So send me your fall and bird images for Luminar, and send me your water and bird images for Lightroom. And until next time, take care and stay out of any hurricanes. See you.